Hi, it's Mark Granis with Lecture 5.2, Quality, Quantity, and Standard Form in Categorical Propositions. This corresponds to Section 5.2 of our text, The Reasonable Person, and this will allow us to get to four basic categorical propositions. We learned last time what a categorical proposition was, and at the end of today's lecture, we'll know that there are only four basic types of categorical proposition that we'll ever deal with in this course, and we will be using them for quite some time, so it's good to get this down now. Well, here's what we're going to do today. We will talk about form and matter in categorical propositions, what it means for them to be formally identical and what it means for them to be materially identical. And then we'll talk about quality, that is the affirmative or negative quality of every proposition, formally speaking, and quantity, whether a proposition, a categorical proposition, is universal, particular, or singular, the other way in which categorical propositions can differ formally. And then we'll talk about standard logical form, QSCP, something that will be very important for the rest of this chapter and for indeed the next 3 chapters or so. And with that, we can show a chart of our four basic categorical propositions, A, E, I, and O. Okay, let's get started. All categorical propositions either affirm or deny one predicate of one subject. That makes them as simple as they could be, right? Because you can't have any proposition at all unless you have at least one predicate and one subject. So if you have only one predicate and one subject, you're really stripping things down to their simplest form. And when we do that, the simplicity makes it possible for us to see formal similarities across lots of different, apparently different propositions. Indeed, formal identity in propositions as different as that chair is black and that monkey is trained. Those two propositions that I've used as examples deal with different matter. One of them deals with chair color, predicating blackness of the chair, and one of them deals with monkey tricks, predicating a certain training or disposition or habit maybe in the monkey. But those two propositions have the same form. That is, each of them has one subject and one predicate, and we predicate the predicate of the subject, of course. So it's subject is predicate, or simply S is P. That form matches or accommodates both of those propositions, even though they deal with different matter. By contrast, look at these two propositions. That chair is black, and that chair is not black. Well, those two propositions deal with the very same matter. That is, they have the same subject and the same predicate. Chair is the subject in both, and black is the predicate in both. But those two propositions differ formally. That chair is black because it's affirming blackness of the chair, has the form S is P. But that chair is not black because it's denying blackness of the chair, has the form S is not P. So the formal difference between S is P and S is not P is one of quality. This is what we refer to as the quality of the proposition. We define the quality of the proposition as affirmative or negative depending on whether the proposition affirms or denies the predicate of the subject. Note that this is not a definition of quality as such. We've already defined quality in the course of our study of the 10 categories. But this is a specific definition of quality that applies only to the categorical proposition. So affirmative or negative, depending on whether the proposition affirms or denies the predicate of the subject. S is P affirms P of S, and so that's the affirmative quality. S is not P denies P of S, and so we call that negative. Now, you wouldn't think that I would have to say this, but experience tells me that I do. Whether we call this proposition affirmative or negative has absolutely nothing to do with our feelings. So if we affirm that the earthquake was deadly, that is affirmative, even though we're very sorry that the earthquake was deadly, even though we would have preferred that there be no earthquake. Similarly, the test was not difficult is a negative proposition, even though we may be very happy that the test was not difficult. So it's not really about feelings. It's only about the difference between is and is not, the part of the proposition that stands between the subject and the predicate. Are we affirming the predicate of the subject, or are we denying that the predicate is true of the subject? Now, technically, that part between the subject and the predicate is called the copula, which we define as the verb of being that relates the predicate to the subject, either affirmatively or negatively. What's a verb of being? I'm glad you asked. In English, we have 8 of them. The ones that work without auxiliaries are is, am, are, was, and were. S is P. Sometimes if it's an I, it would be I am, you are, things like that. And then be, being, and been all work with auxiliaries. Any of those is a verb of being, and we can use that as a copula. We can't use active verbs. We can't use any verb other than a verb of being as the copula. Well, does that mean that we can't logically analyze a statement like Michigan beat Ohio State again this year? No, of course we can. We accommodate other forms, such as active verbs, with an abbreviation or one of 2 abbreviations. It will either be TW or TWI. It's TW for verbs, it's TWI for adjectives and adverbs, and that works like this. So if we have a sentence like, the lion sleeps tonight, sleeps is an active verb, and so it's not a verb of being. What do we do with that? Well, we put brackets around the subject, which is the lion, braces that is, around the subject. And then we put an is there because we have to have an is, and then we move that active verb into the predicate. So we come up with the lion is that which sleeps tonight. Are we allowed to do that? Sure we are. This is called translation, and we'll spend a little bit more time later in the chapter talking about translation as its own thing. But I will just tell you now what the basic rule of translation is. We're only interested in logic in the thoughts. We're interested in the ideas. We're not that interested in the words used. So you can change any word, you can change every word, as long as you don't change the meaning of what's being said. You can move stuff around to facilitate logical analysis. So this is a perfectly good translation here. The lion is that which sleeps tonight. That's not what you would sing if you were singing Weem Away, but that is what's being predicated here. Similarly, Mr. Morton talked to his cat becomes Mr. Morton is that which talked to his cat. We just put the TW in there for that which. Note that we would never say that which of a person like Mr. Morton. We would say something like Mr. Morton is he who talked to his cat. Doesn't matter. We're going to use TW as our abbreviation all the time because we always know what that means. It just means that which, and don't worry about the fact that nobody would talk like that. The whole point of translating is to get to the logical content and not to make it sound pretty. So don't worry about that. What's the TWI for? The TWI is for when you use an adverb or an adjective there. And you won't really understand why we have to do that until maybe next chapter. But again, just to jump ahead a little bit, we always want the predicate to act like a noun because sometimes we need to switch the predicate and the subject around and see what that produces. So we'll get to the reasons for that later, but just know for now that TW and TWI are the abbreviations that we will always use when we need to change out the verb in the middle of the sentence in order to use a linking verb instead. All right, so that's quality. What about quantity? Quantity is either universal, particular, or singular, depending on whether the proposition applies to all inferiors of the subject, some inferiors of the subject, or to a singular subject. Let's give some examples of those three. So a universal proposition, a proposition with universal quantity, would be something like all men are mortal, all short putts miss the cup, anything like that. And we can translate all of that to all S is P. The all tells us that we mean this to be universal of all instances of the subject. The particular proposition is when we only mean to predicate the predicate of some part of the subject, some part of the subject's extension. So some dogs are friendly, some lawyers are crooks. We would translate that to some S is P, and the some tells us this statement is particular. Well, there's the third possibility in the definition. It is that it could be a singular. Singular is like Socrates is a man. We don't even have a universal there at all. So maybe you would just say S is P there. But here's the important thing about singulars is that we always treat them as universals for all purposes. So you don't really have to worry about whether you write all S is P or just S is P, as long as you treat it as if it were a universal. If you want to think about that as, you're trying to figure out why that makes sense, it seems like if you're talking about only one thing, that would be particular rather than universal. But think of it this way: all of Socrates is a man. All of Socrates is mortal. So when you have a singular, you're not usually dicing it up, or by definition, you're not talking about some but not others or something like that. So singulars, we will encounter them a lot, but they're not going to be treated as having a special quantity, because the quantity of a singular is always a proposition of singular quantity is always treated the same way as a categorical proposition of universal quantity. We put all or some before the S is P to indicate the quantity, and we call that part of the proposition the quantifier. So all in the examples above is a quantifier. Some in the examples above is a quantifier. So now that we know about the subject, the predicate, the quantifier, and the copula, we're ready to learn about standard logical form, which is QSCP. It's only 4 letters. And amazingly, some people will still ask me in a month what standard logical form means. It means these 4 letters, QSCP. In standard logical form, every categorical proposition has these 4 elements in this order: a quantifier, Q, a subject, S, a copula, C, and a predicate, P. Those 4 elements in that order. So this is all captured by the formula, say it with me, Q, S, C, P. Now S and P obviously refer to the matter of the proposition, which is where we started, right? The subject and the predicate. If we want to know whether 2 statements are materially the same, we look and see whether they have the same subject and the same predicate. Then they're materially identical. Q and C are about form. So Q tells us the formal quantity, because it's the quantifier, and C tells us the formal quality. Well, in most languages it does. Not really in English all the time, because there's a little bit of a curveball regarding negative universals. And we can see that best if we go to this chart of the 4 basic categorical propositions. No matter what language you're learning, anyone who uses the Roman alphabet who's learning logic is going to learn these 4 basic categorical propositions as A, E, I, and O. And I'll explain why in a minute. But note that the 2 qualities and the 2 quantities give us 4 basic forms, right? And so that's what you see here. Note that because we treat singulars as universals, we don't have 6 forms. We only have 2. The quantity can be either universal or particular, and the quality can be either affirmative or negative. It's a 2x2 matrix. Now, some, as a quantifier, works perfectly well for both affirmative and negative propositions. But here's the curveball in English. All, in English, only works well for affirmatives. That is, I can say all men are mortal, and that's just fine. But what if I want to deny something of all of the subject? What if I say, for example, all cars are not fast? What would that mean to a native English speaker? Well, in English, we would normally say, it's at least ambiguous whether you mean that there's no fast cars. Are all cars unfast? Or does it mean that not all cars are fast? And in English, mostly, we think that the not goes with the all. All that glitters is not gold. What does that mean? It means not all the things that glitter are actually gold. That's what we usually mean by that. So for clarity, in English, we use no S is P whenever we are negating something universally. And that's why you don't have, as the E statement in the chart, all S is not P. We say instead, no S is P. We wouldn't have to do this if it were in Latin, but we do it in English, and anywhere that you learn logic in English, this is the way it will be expressed. Sometimes you'll find someone say every S is P in the A statement, but the majority of people say all. Why do we call them A, E, I, and O? Well, the A and the I come from affirmo, the Latin for I affirm, and the E and O come from nego, the Latin for I deny. And so these are long-standing abbreviations, A, E, I, and O, the only four categorical propositions that you have to worry about. And next time, we will learn about how to visualize what these propositions are telling us. That's it for now. Thanks.